I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my street. The air felt heavier. The kind of heaviness that warns you a storm is coming long before you see the clouds. My porch lights were on, even though I'd turned them off that morning. And 3 unfamiliar cars were parked in my driveway like they belonged there. But what chilled me wasn't the cars. It was the sound of voices inside my home, arguing, demanding, claiming authority they never had. And when I stepped onto my own porch, the HOA president appeared at my door, acting as if I was the intruder. Before everything unraveled, life in the Ridgeway Pines community felt almost peaceful. I'd bought my cabin there for the quiet more than anything. Tucked between tall pines, far enough from the city to breathe, but close enough to civilization that groceries and a warm dinner weren't an hour's drive away. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee on the deck, a soft breeze coming through the trees, the distant hum of lawnmowers starting up as neighbors eased into their routines. On paper, it was the kind of place people dreamed of retiring to someday. Safe, predictable, orderly. At first, the HOA barely crossed my mind. Their monthly newsletters were filled with reminders about porch paint colors, trash can placement, and lawn height. Annoying, sure, but nothing that felt personal. I'd laugh sometimes at how seriously they took things. But as long as they stayed out of my way, I didn't think much about it. Most of the board members were the type who waved politely, but didn't say much else. The president, Linda, although everyone whispered, Karen, behind her back, carried herself with the stiff posture of someone who believed she'd been chosen for greatness, but tragically overlooked by the rest of the world. She had a habit of walking the neighborhood like a patrol officer, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for imperfections. Still, even her presence was just background noise back then. My cabin was my refuge, especially after long work trips. I traveled often, sometimes gone for a week or more, and coming home to that quiet space was the best part of my routine. I'd unlock the door, breathe in the familiar scent of cedar and cold mountain air, and instantly feel grounded again. The neighbors all knew I traveled, but that never seemed to be a problem. If anything, it gave me a sense of independence. I wasn't tied to anyone, and no one was tied to me. Looking back, small signs had been creeping in long before I noticed them. A flyer shoved under my door reminding residents to notify the HOA of prolonged absences. A warning email sent to the whole community about vacant homes becoming community risks. A neighbor mentioning, almost offhandedly, that Linda had brought up my house at a recent meeting, questioning whether it was being properly monitored. During my trips, I brushed it off. People talk, rules shift, HOAs get bored. None of it felt threatening. But quietly, a different tone had been settling over the neighborhood. Something sharper, more intrusive. New committees were forming, new safety checks were being introduced. And more residents were receiving fines for things they hadn't even realized were violations. The HOA began treating the community less like a neighborhood and more like a controlled experiment. I didn't notice how much their behavior had changed until the day I returned from a trip to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. Property access inspection notice. It read, claiming they'd attempted to enter my cabin for a routine safety check while I was gone. The phrasing felt wrong. The boldness felt wrong. And the fact that I had never approved such access made cold suspicion creep up my spine. When I asked about it later, their explanation sounded too rehearsed, too confident, as if they'd already prepared for pushback. Something about ensuring the security of unoccupied homes Something about community protection standards. It felt invasive, but I still shrugged it off, assuming it was just another one of their overreaching initiatives. I had no idea then that this was only the first boundary they'd try to cross. And that every time I failed to push back, they took it as permission to step further. For a while, life went back to normal, at least on the surface. The trees still swayed. The mornings were still quiet. The cabin still felt like mine. But the HOA's eyes were shifting toward it in a way I didn't fully grasp. And soon, their curiosity would turn into entitlement. Their entitlement into control. And that control into something much worse. Because one day, when I returned home earlier than expected, I would discover just how far they were willing to go when they believed a house, my house, was better off in their hands than mine. For a while after the so-called inspection notice, things settled just enough that I convinced myself I was overthinking. The HOA seemed quieter. Or maybe I was just too focused on work to notice the little things. Like how Linda had started walking slower past my cabin, lingering near the edge of my property as if waiting for something to be out of place. Or how a few neighbors suddenly stopped making eye contact, offering tight smiles instead of casual waves. It was all subtle, small enough to ignore, but unsettling enough to gnaw at the back of my mind. Then came the first fine. It appeared in my mailbox like a warning shot. A $150 penalty for failure to maintain adequate exterior appearance. According to the notice, there had been visible clutter on my deck. The detailed description listed 2 items: a pair of boots and an empty flower pot. Things that had been there for months, untouched, never mentioned by anyone. When I reached out to the HOA office, the response was swift and disturbingly confident. They claimed the rules had been updated, though no such update had been shared. They said it was my responsibility to keep the property neat and presentable, in accordance with the community's evolving standards. Evolving, as if the rules were living things that shifted whenever the board felt bored or restless. I argued, pushed back, insisted the fine was baseless. They didn't budge. Eventually, I paid it, not because I believed it was fair, but because it was the quickest way to end the conversation. I had no idea that paying it would be the signal they were waiting for. The moment I silently confirmed I was willing to comply, if pushed hard enough. Within weeks, more notices began to appear. A warning about overgrown shrubs, even though they'd been trimmed a month earlier. A complaint about improper window coverings, referring to the same blinds that had been installed since the day I moved in. Another fine for leaving the garbage bin visible for more than 12 hours, even though it had been placed at the street, according to pickup rules. I started to feel eyes on me every time I stepped outside. Watchful, judgmental eyes belonging to a board with too much time and too little accountability. Every inch of my yard suddenly felt like contested territory. Still, the most unsettling shift wasn't the fines. It was the HOA's sudden preoccupation with my schedule. They began sending surveys asking for home occupancy information, requesting that residents disclose their typical travel dates for community safety monitoring. I ignored them, at first silently, then deliberately. That made the HOA call, not politely, not with concern, but with a sense of authority that didn't belong to them. They wanted to know when I'd be gone next, how long, whether I'd arranged for someone to oversee the property in my absence. The tone made it clear this wasn't a request, it was an expectation. I pushed back, hard this time. I reminded them I paid dues, not rent, that I owned the property outright, that my schedule was none of their business. Their response was icy and precise. Community compliance depends on predictable homeowner availability. Predictable. A chilling word. After that call, the tension became almost physical. A weight on the air, a tightening of the neighborhood's personality. Neighbors who had once chatted casually at the mailbox now glanced at me with a mix of discomfort and fear, as if my unwillingness to fall in line might somehow spill over onto them. My next work trip came at a time when the HOA's pressure was rising like steam in a sealed pot. I tried to shake the worry off, convinced they wouldn't dare go further than the petty fines and invasive questions. But a knot sat in my stomach the morning I left, heavy enough to make me pause at the front door and wonder whether I should install new locks, cameras, anything that made my home feel safer. I didn't, and that was my mistake. The first sign something was seriously wrong came 3 days into the trip. It was late at night when I checked my email out of habit. There, buried among work messages and promotional spam, was a new email from the HOA with the subject line: Property Update. Successful access attempt. A cold wave went through me. I opened the message with my heart pounding. Inside was a short note thanking me for granting permission for an emergency welfare inspection. Something I had never done. They claimed a neighbor had reported unusual activity near my cabin and that they'd entered the premises to ensure everything was secure and safe. No details, no photos, no explanation of what unusual activity meant. I emailed back instantly, demanding answers. No response. I called, voicemail. I emailed again. Silence. The next day, I called a neighbor I trusted, someone who usually kept an eye on the community's happenings. Her voice trembled when she picked up. She told me she'd heard that the HOA had been inside my cabin. Not for minutes, but for hours. They had been seen going in and out with clipboards, measuring tapes, boxes. My stomach dropped. I ended my trip early, feeling a sense of dread that grew heavier with every mile toward home. I kept imagining what they could have done inside. What they thought they had the right to touch. What they believed I wouldn't notice. When I finally reached the entrance to Ridgeway Pines, I noticed something immediately off. Cars I didn't recognize were parked along the street, clustered near my driveway. My porch lights were on again, despite being off when I left. And a strange shadow moved behind my living room curtains. A presence where no presence should have been. As I walked up the driveway, a noise drifted from inside my cabin. Not a single voice, but several. Casual, comfortable, as if they belonged there. My home. The place that anchored me after every chaotic trip was filled with someone else's conversations. My heartbeat hammered in my ears as I reached for the doorknob. But before I could touch it, the door opened from the inside. Standing there was Linda, the HOA president, with a smile so calmly condescending it made my skin crawl. Her posture was relaxed, shoulders slightly back, chin lifted in the way people do when they feel untouchable. Behind her, I saw movement. Her husband walking through my kitchen with a plate of food, her daughter lounging on my couch with a blanket that belonged to me, a teenager rummaging through the pantry, as if searching for snacks in their own home. My breath caught in my throat. Linda stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, as if shielding the scene inside from my view. She spoke to me with the serene authority of someone explaining a minor inconvenience. She said the cabin had been assessed as vacant, that the HOA had taken temporary stewardship, that her family was ensuring the property was actively utilized to benefit the community. Each word hit like ice. She ended her explanation with a statement so surreal, I felt the world tilt for a moment. She said that by being gone so often, I had forfeited consistent occupancy standards, and the HOA had intervened accordingly. When I tried to push past her, she blocked me with a smile and said a phrase that made the hair on my arms rise. If you enter without authorization, we'll have no choice but to treat you as a trespasser. Those words echoed in my skull. A trespasser. In my own home, the shock froze me long enough for her to slip back inside and close the door, locking it from within. I stood on my own porch, breathing hard, staring through a window at a family that wasn't mine moving around a home that was. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but in a twist I couldn't have imagined, the dispatcher told me something that made my blood run cold. Police had already received a call from the HOA about my attempt to unlawfully enter a community-controlled property. Officers were already en route to deal with me. My world narrowed to a single, horrifying thought. They weren't just invading my home. They were rewriting the narrative to make me the intruder. And the moment the police arrived, I would find out just how much influence the HOA truly had, and how easily truth could be twisted into something unrecognizable. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 cars pulling up with the kind of urgency reserved for dangerous situations. Except there was nothing dangerous here. Nothing except the lie the HOA had fed them. I stood frozen on my own porch as the officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes narrowed at me, not the strangers living inside my house. Before I could speak, the front door swung open again. Linda emerged like she was welcoming honored guests. She greeted the officers with a smooth, practiced warmth and launched into a story so polished it made my stomach twist. She claimed I'd been absent for months, that the HOA had assumed custody of an abandoned property, that her family was maintaining it responsibly until ownership could be reassessed. Every sentence was a weapon. I tried to interrupt, but the officers raised a hand, asking me to remain calm. Hearing those words on my own porch, after being locked out of my own home, lit a fire inside me that pushed past the shock. I forced myself to breathe, then presented the officers with the facts. I showed them my ID with the cabin's address. I showed them the property deed, still in my name. I pulled up flight receipts proving I'd only been gone for a few days. But every time I handed them something concrete, Linda countered with another soft, poisonous lie. She insisted the HOA had been forced to intervene due to suspicious patterns, that I'd refused cooperation, that she had documentation on file showing community concern. It didn't matter that none of it made sense. She spoke with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed she couldn't be challenged. The officers hesitated, not convinced by her, but clearly confused by the conflicting claims. I watched one of them glance between my deed and the padlocked door behind her. For a moment, the truth seemed to be winning, until her husband stepped outside. He carried a folder filled with printed papers, which he handed to the officers with the triumph of someone dropping the final piece into a puzzle only he could see. I recognized the papers immediately. Photos of my cabin, taken during those unauthorized inspections. Notes claiming signs of long-term vacancy. Logs alleging multiple failed contact attempts. None of it was true, yet laid out on paper, it created a narrative strong enough to cast doubt on mine. One officer muttered that it was messy, and that they'd need to figure out jurisdiction. But as the HOA family gathered behind Linda, watching with smug confidence, it hit me, they genuinely believed they'd won. They believed they had outmaneuvered me so thoroughly that even the law would lean their direction. That realization sparked something in me I didn't know I had. A cold, steady clarity. I told the officers I needed 5 minutes to retrieve something from my car. They agreed, watching carefully, but no longer treating me like a threat. They didn't realize I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for the truth. In my glove compartment was a small USB drive and a remote battery pack. Pieces of a system I'd installed months earlier, after a break-in scare at a previous home. A hidden camera system wired discreetly beneath the siding of the cabin. Cameras the HOA didn't know existed. Cameras that captured everything. I plugged the drive into my phone with shaking hands. The loading bar crawled slowly, agonizingly, until finally, there it was. Time-stamped footage of the HOA board, led by Linda, unlocking my door with tools they weren't authorized to have. Footage of them walking inside, opening drawers, wandering through rooms, taking notes, discussing, repurposing the cabin. Footage of them returning the next day with boxes, cleaning supplies, and personal items. Footage of them moving in. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at the screen, rage simmering beneath every inch of my skin. Then I walked back to the officers and asked them to watch something. The shift was instant. Their posture changed. Their expressions hardened. One of them straightened so quickly, he nearly dropped the folder of fake documentation. They watched clip after clip, each more damning than the last. The unauthorized entry, the casual rummaging, the HOA members carrying their own belongings into my home. The sound of their voices discussing full transfer of occupancy made one officer mutter under his breath. The officers exchanged a look, the kind of look that says everything. The tide had turned. They asked Linda to step forward. Her smile faltered, then vanished entirely as they informed her she and her family were required to exit the property immediately. Her voice shook as she argued, insisting the footage must have been edited or taken out of context. But the officers were done listening. They called for additional units, treating the situation now as unlawful entry and potential fraud. As reinforcements arrived, neighbors began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. I saw the whispers start, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The once untouchable HOA president was now trembling on my porch, surrounded by officers, her confident facade collapsing. Her husband tried to argue, but an officer cut him off sharply. Her daughter slammed the door inside, before storming out with a backpack. The teenager who had been rummaging in my pantry earlier sprinted through the back. Like he was avoiding a crime scene, the officers entered my cabin, this time legally, and with me at their side, to assess the interior for damages. What I saw made my jaw tighten. My furniture had been rearranged. My bedroom had been turned into a makeshift office with HOA binders stacked on my nightstand. My pantry had been raided. My fridge was filled with groceries I hadn't bought. Punked. There were clothes that didn't belong to me draped over chairs. Shoes scattered across the entryway. It wasn't just trespassing. It was a takeover. As we exited the cabin, a full crowd had gathered on the street. The officers announced that the HOA had violated property laws and would be removed pending further investigation. The gasp that rippled through the neighborhood was sharp, collective, almost cathartic. But the moment that defined everything came next. When the officers informed Linda she would be detained for questioning, she snapped. Not with anger, but with a desperate, unraveling panic. She insisted she had the right to re-sign occupancy. She insisted I was unfit. She insisted the board had voted to repurpose unused homes. She insisted the community belonged to the HOA. And that was when her illusion shattered. Neighbors who once walked on eggshells around her now looked horrified. Some whispered that they'd felt pressured for years. Others murmured about strange fines, invasive questions, and unexplained HOA decisions. It was like watching a wall fall, one built on fear, finally cracking under truth. As the officers led her toward the patrol car, she twisted back toward me with a look that was part hatred, part disbelief, as if she genuinely couldn't comprehend how she'd lost control. But she had, completely, because not only had I reclaimed my home, I now held proof of everything they'd done. Every entry, every lie, every abuse of power, and the HOA, once the ruling entity of Ridgeway Pines, now stood on the edge of collapse. As the patrol car door closed behind her, the neighborhood fell into a stunned silence. The flashing lights reflected off the cabin windows, casting sharp streaks across the ground. And for the first time since the nightmare began, the power dynamic had flipped. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one holding the truth, and the consequences for the HOA were only just beginning. In the days that followed the HOA's collapse, Ridgeway Pines felt like a community exhaling for the first time in years. The silence was different now. Not the uneasy quiet created by fear or surveillance, but a genuine calm. A reset. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm finally rips itself apart. And sunlight breaks through the wreckage. The morning, after the police removed Linda and her family from my cabin, I walked through the house slowly, taking in every detail that no longer belonged to me. Stray socks on the floor. A dirty cup in the sink, a binder full of HOA violation forms left open on the kitchen table, with dozens of pages containing notes about my property, and several other homes in the neighborhood. The invasion wasn't just physical. It was psychological, a deliberate attempt to turn private space into controlled territory. A restoration team arrived that afternoon to help me document damages, clean what needed to be cleaned, and secure the home properly. Every locked drawer they'd opened, every appliance they'd used, every item they'd moved. Some repairs were small. Others, oddly enough, were intentional alterations, like the fact that my office had been stripped of personal decor and transformed into something resembling an administrative workstation. It was clear now the HOA had been preparing for a long-term stay. Insurance was surprisingly cooperative once they saw the footage and reports, but the emotional toll wasn't something paperwork could fix. For days, I woke up half expecting to hear unfamiliar footsteps or whispered conversations drifting from the hall. For the first time, my cabin, the place that had always grounded me, felt like unfamiliar ground. Yet the strangest part was how the community responded. One by one, neighbors who had kept their distance for months began stopping by. Some brought food. Others brought supportive notes. A few brought documents. Old fines, warnings, letters, each representing their own experiences with the HOA's creeping overreach. People shared stories of unfair penalties, intrusive inspections, and board meetings that discouraged questions. Many admitted they'd been too scared to push back. Linda had built her authority slowly, like a wall rising brick by brick, until no one could see over it. But now the wall had cracks. And through those cracks, the truth poured out. The police investigation expanded quickly once other residents came forward. What started as a trespassing case became something much larger. Fraud, document falsification, misuse of HOA funds, unlawful entry, coercion, and even personal property theft. The binder left in my kitchen was a goldmine of evidence. Notes revealing a pattern of targeting. Low engagement homeowners. Those who traveled often. Those who worked long hours. Those least likely to notice the gradual erosion of their rights. According to the logs, I wasn't the first house they tried to re-sign. But I was the first who fought back with irrefutable proof. Within 2 weeks, the entire HOA board resigned or was removed. The HOA's legal counsel withdrew representation. State investigators stepped in, and suddenly Ridgeway Pines wasn't just a quiet community anymore. It was a case study in how an HOA's unchecked power could metastasize into something resembling a private dictatorship. Meanwhile, I found myself at the center of a storm I never asked for. Lawyers contacted me. Reporters tried. Neighbors thanked me. And amidst it all, I was just trying to reclaim normalcy in my own home. Every day I walked through the cabin to remind myself that it was mine again. Every day it felt a little more like home. As weeks passed, the community formed an interim committee. This time led by residents who had been ignored or silenced under the previous board. They invited me to attend the first open meeting. I debated whether to go, unsure if being there would bring peace or rekindle anger. But eventually, curiosity won. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a room that had once felt unwelcoming and cold, but now buzzed with cautious hope. The turnout was huge. People sat side by side, whispering as if afraid the walls might still carry secrets. When I arrived, the room quieted. Someone thanked me. Then another. Then someone else. Their gratitude wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind that carried weight, like relief they didn't have to hide anymore. For the first time, the community wasn't afraid to speak openly. They passed around testimony, receipts, emails, screenshots, pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of long-term abuse of power. The interim committee proposed dissolving the HOA altogether. The room erupted with relief. When the motion passed, people cried. Not from sadness, but from release. From freedom. But even as the community healed, the legal aftermath for the HOA's former president was still unfolding. When the case went to court, I testified. Several neighbors did too. The footage from my cabin was the centerpiece of the trial. An undeniable account of trespass, manipulation, and orchestrated control. The prosecution called it a deliberate attempt to expropriate private property under the guise of community governance. In the end, Linda was convicted on multiple charges. Her husband faced charges of unlawful entry and falsification. The rest of the board received fines and community service sentences for their involvement, or for knowing and doing nothing. As they were escorted out of the courthouse, I didn't feel triumph or revenge. What I felt was closure, a kind of calm that comes from knowing truth had finally outrun deceit. Not long after the trial, I decided to renovate the cabin. Not because it was damaged, but because I needed to reclaim the space psychologically. New paint. A different arrangement of furniture. A lock system upgraded with transparency instead of fear. Every change was a step toward reclaiming the refuge I'd nearly lost. And slowly, the cabin became mine again. The community changed too. Neighbors who once avoided one another now chatted at mailboxes. People started taking evening walks again. The once feared HOA office building became a community storage space. The interim committee shifted to a voluntary neighborhood group with no authority to impose fines, only to coordinate events and share updates. Without the constant threat of surveillance or punishment, the whole neighborhood softened. Stories began to flow. Stories of people who had been fined for lawn colors, mailbox designs, parked cars, porch lights, or curtains that didn't match community standards. Stories of families intimidated into compliance or threatened with penalties they couldn't afford. Stories of complaints filed and mysteriously dismissed. Stories of people who almost lost their homes because the HOA believed they weren't using them properly. The frightening part was how normalized it had all become. Until someone stepped out of line, just enough to reveal the rot beneath the community's perfect facade. Now, months later, I sometimes sit on the restored deck with a cup of coffee, letting the morning air move freely again. The trees sway the same way they always did, but something about the light feels different. Warmer, as if the space itself recognizes it's no longer being watched through hostile eyes. I still travel for work. But now, when I do, trusted neighbors volunteer to check in, not to monitor compliance, but to water plants or bring in packages. When I return, there are notes on my door welcoming me home instead of warnings taped to it. The cabin is no longer a battleground. It's a sanctuary again. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't installed those cameras. If I hadn't come home early. If I had ignored the unease that started as a whisper and grew into a shout. The thought sends a chill through me every time. Because the truth is, people don't lose their homes overnight. They lose them bit by bit. Through fear, through silence, through trusting the wrong people with too much power. That's the part that stays with me. Not the confrontation, not the trial, but the realization that quiet communities can hide loud dangers. That neighbors who seem harmless can become something else when given authority without accountability. That an HOA, meant to protect property values, can become the very threat it claims to guard against. And so, here's the question I find myself asking, the question I think every homeowner should ask. How much power should any organization have over the place you call home? Because once a line is crossed, it's almost impossible to walk it back. And the only thing more dangerous than a tyrant is a tyrant that believes they're acting for the good of the community. Now, Ridgeway Pines is free. My home is safe. And the people who once whispered are finally speaking out. But the memory of what almost happened, that stays with me, as a warning, a reminder, and a story worth telling. And maybe that's the real takeaway. A home is more than walls and keys. It's a boundary, a right, a promise. And no HOA, no matter how powerful, ever has the authority to take that away.